Good morning, everybody. We are dealing with All My Sons, the very famous drama written by the American dramatist Arthur Miller. As we said, Arthur Miller, 1915 to 2005, is an American playwright and essayist in the 20th century American theater. And All My Sons, along with The Death of the Salesman, The Crucible, and A View from Bridge, are his super duper hits on the theater. He wrote several screenplays and was most noted for his work on The Misfits that he had written in 1951. All My Sons, a play in three acts, is set in a small town several years after the World War II and begins with Jim Bayliss, a doctor, and Joe Keller, head of the Keller family, sitting in the Keller's backyard reading the paper. A storm the previous night has shone in half a tree that is revealed to memorialize Larry Keller, one of the two Keller children, the son who did not survive the war. As you could see, this is the place where the story begins. There was a great storm, and you could see a tree within the picture, the tree which is broken down into half because there was a great storm the previous night. And with this, the act begins. The stage directions describe the Keller home as suited in an American suburb. It is roughly August 1947. The house is comfortable and well kept as in the yard. Downstage left stands an apple tree stump that you could see. The trunk and the branches are toppled beside it because of the storm the previous night had experienced. Joe Keller is in his yard reading the want ads. He is a self-made businessman of about 60 years. Dr. Jim Bayliss, his neighbor, is about 40 and he is reading the paper too, sitting beside him. Joe's neighbor on the other side, Frank, enters, who is around 32 years old. The neighbors, Dr. Jim Bayliss, Joe Keller, and Frank, chat about the weather and the want ads. Frank notices the felled tree. It was struck by lightning in the night. He observes how strange it is that the tree planted in memory of Larry was struck down in his birth month. Larry is Joe's son. He would have been 27 this August, but Frank remembers because he is working on Larry's horoscope. What Frank is trying to figure out, at the request of Kate is Joe's wife, is whether the day on which Larry was reported missing was his favorable day, favorable in inverted commas, when astrologically speaking, odds are he wouldn't die. This piques skeptical Jim's interest. He doesn't buy it. Talk turns to Annie, a young woman who used to live next door. She is visiting the Kellers and is upstairs asleep for now. Jim makes a quip about how the block could use a pretty face. Just then, his fat wife enters, nagging him about a patient's phone call. Frank's wife Lydia also comes in, also curious about Annie. Is she engaged? Because she was Larry's betrothed or fiancée. Very surprisingly, Chris Keller enters. He is around 32 years and he starts reading the book section. Joe and Chris start to talk about Larry's tree when 8-year-old neighbor Bert enters. His Joe's deputy and tattles on some of the other kids on the street. He seeks to the jail Joe keeps in his basement, but Joe would not let him there. This is the boy who enters, whose name is Brett, and he considers Joe to be a policeman And Joe convinces Brett that there is a small prison in the cellar, and Brett comes asking Joe to show him his cellar. He tells every bit of information that happens in the neighbor to Joe. Joe keeps in his basement, but Joe won't allow him to see the cellar or the prison, and so Bert agrees. The talks turn back to the tree. Chris says that mom saw the tree broken last night to his father. She was outside when it broke, then she came in and cried a lot because the tree was symbolic of her son, Larry. Kate Keller still believes that Larry is coming back, even though it has been 3 years that he is missing. Chris thinks they should puncture the illusion. Joe wants to keep it intact. Chris sits near his father and says, I'm going to propose to Annie, but mom still thinks that she is Larry's girl. Now, Chris wanted his father to help him in convincing his mother in this matter. Chris threatens to leave the town and also the family business and go away if his father doesn't encourage his mother to support this marriage. Joe is shocked at the conviction of Chris towards Anne. Now, meanwhile, Kate enters. Kate is a woman in her early 50s. She is happy the tree blew down because it affirms for her that Larry is still alive. They were in a rush to memorialize him with that tree. Kate and Chris tiptoe around a discussion of Anne. Kate doesn't want to acknowledge that Chris might be counting her. Kate recalls a dream she had about Larry last night. When she heard the wind, she imagined it was Larry fighting by in his fighter plane. Kate turns to Joe and wags her finger at him. They shouldn't have planted that tree. They gave up too soon. When Chris exits to get his mother an aspirin, she turns on Joe. Chris better not be planning to propose to Annie. Joe says he doesn't know anything more than she does, which is an outright lie that Joe says to his wife Kate. Kate wants Joe to believe with her that Larry will definitely come back, and he asks her to calm down. They are again intervened by this boy who is called as Bert, who brings up the jail. Kate reacts very sharply this time, telling that there is no jail in there and he doesn't want the boy to be moving about there. And so he leaves. Now, at this juncture, we could see Anne entering into the garden from the house. She is beautiful and beautifully dressed. She's been living in New York. When Chris shows his admiration for Anne, Kate comments lightly that she has put on a little weight. Anne remarks on the little changes in the neighborhood. Trees, a missing hammock. She is introduced to Jim, who now lives in her old house in the same town. When Anne mentions Larry, Kate is relieved. Eventually, she asks Anne directly if she's waiting for Larry. But surprisingly, Anne says that she is not waiting for Larry anymore. Frank enters and dispels the tension. A little small talk, and then Frank mentions Anne's father, who is in the prison. Anne is sensitive in this issue. She wants to know if the neighbors still talk about her father and his crime. Her father's name is Steve, and Chris and Joe immediately say that the neighbors no more talk about her father and his crime. Anne remembers the neighbors screaming murderers, murderers at her father Steve and at Joe a few years back when he was kept in the prison. In a long monologue now, Joe recalls the day he was cleared of the crime. He and Steve had been accused of selling cracked cylinder heads to the Air Force, causing 21 planes to crash. Joe was exonerated or pardoned on the health grounds, but Anne's father was imprisoned. When Joe returned home, he walked down the street with defiance and pride that he is acquitted. He suggests the same for Steve when he is released later after suffering his imprisonment. Anne admits that neither she nor her brother George keep in touch with their father anymore. They blame him for knowingly shipping out faulty parts, resulting in the crash of fighter planes and the death of 21 American pilots. She wonders aloud whether this was responsible for Larry's death. Now, this upsets Kate wonderfully when Anne should never have said this at all because she has directly referred to the death of 21 American pilots and also mentions that Larry's death also might be possible. And this actually makes Kate very intense. Joe Keller tells his version of the story. Joe himself was not keeping good health in those days. There was a mad rush for the parts, and when the cylinders came out cracked, in the absence of Joe because of his poor health, cowardly, Steve just decided to send them out. He was afraid that Joe and the military would be displeased with the mistake, so he kept quiet about it. Now, in this juncture, Chris breaks in. He just wants to change the subject because it has become intense. So they talk about the steak and champagne instead of Joe Keller and other things. Meanwhile, Joe exits because he never wanted to talk and he becomes all of a sudden very serious. Along with Joe, even his wife Kate exits. The long awaited proposal occurs when Chris and Anne are left alone on the stage. Chris proposes Anne, and Anne immediately agrees to his marriage proposal. Now that they have just to figure out how to tell this occasion of marriage to Kate. Chris has something to get off his chest. It is about the war. Leading a company during the World War, and he lost all his men in the war. Only he returned safe, whereas the rest of his soldiers have been dead in the war. And he felt that nobody noticed it, that the sacrifice of the men who died meant nothing substantial to the people at all, including the people at home. He has a survivor's guilt within him. Chris feels as though he doesn't deserve life and he doesn't deserve Anne also. But Anne is very loving to him. She comes down to him, sets him straight, consoles him, and he does this by telling that he does deserve her. And Anne moves closer to him, catching him, says that everything should be all right now. And this intense emotional moment helps Chris to come out of his predicament. Now, Joe interrupts them, but as there was a phone call from George, who is Anne's brother, informing that George would be coming there to meet his sister, Joe becomes somehow disturbed. He keeps on talking to George on phone, asking him reasons as to why he wants to come there. In this confused moment, Chris tells Joe the news of his engagement to Anne. But Joe is not in a position to listen to anything. He is already preoccupied with his phone call. He is afraid George will want to open up his father's case again because George, apart from being a soldier, also is a lawyer. And so tells George that Anne is on his side and Anne is very happy in his family. Meanwhile, Anne emerges and comes to know that George is coming to settle something and wants to talk to her. He wouldn't say what. That was a secret as to what he was trying to talk to his sister, but he definitely would want to come there and talk to Anne. In a perplexed mood, Anne leaves the stage, and along with Anne, in fact, Chris also leaves the stage, thereby leaving the stage to Joe and Kate. Joe is much disturbed in this moment with the news that George is coming to the town. He doesn't know why George is coming, whether George wants to open the case of his father. He doesn't know what he wants to talk, what George wants to talk to his sister. Does he know anything that he wants to reveal because he says it is a secret? And with this, Joe is emotionally and physically disturbed. Now, Kate wanted Joe to be very smart and remain calm and cool because George, after all, is his friend's son and nothing is going to go wrong. And she wants him to take care of George's emotional health also. With this, we come to the end of Act 1. Act 1 has introduced us to almost all the major characters and the minor characters. Frank Lube, Lydia Lube, who are the neighbors, are introduced. Jim Bayliss and Sue Bayliss, who are the family friends, as Doctor and his wife are introduced to us. And the major characters like Kate Keller, Joe Keller, Chris Keller, and also Anne Deva are introduced to us physically. We come to know about Larry Keller that maybe he is dead on the war because for the last 3 years he hasn't come back and is announced by the army in the list of missing. Anne Dewar, who was the fiancée of Larry Keller, actually now decided to marry Chris. Anne Dewar's brother, George Dewar, and her father, Steve Dewar, are not introduced till we are told that Steve Dewar is kept behind bar and is undergoing a sentence because of supplying the aircraft engines which have blasted, killing 21 pilots along with him. Somehow, in the case, we could see that Joe Keller has escaped because of his health grounds, as he has not participated in the decision at all in using this um, uh, bad part as an engine in the aircraft. But Steve Deaver is sentenced to prison for for using the defective parts in the engines and thereby responsible for the death of 21 pilots of the fighter planes. When everything was going on well, somehow we see in the end of Act 1 that Joe Keller is disturbed with the news that George Deaver is going to come down after meeting his father to meet his sister. With this, we come to the end of Act 1. Let's meet in the Act 2 in the next video.